He was shamed in front of a cabin full of strangers, publicly removed from his seat, demoted without warning, and told with a smile that not everyone fits in first class. All because of his skin color. No explanation, no apology. Just quiet, practiced dismissal at 36,000 feet. No one asked his name. No one cared who he was. And that was their first mistake. This isn't a story about a flight gone wrong. It's a story about what happens when power doesn't flaunt a luxury watch, doesn't announce its presence, and doesn't need to raise its voice to flip the entire system on its head. While the crew chuckled, while passengers whispered, and while someone laughed and muttered, "He should have stayed in his place," they assumed they were watching another incident. Another black man quietly pushed aside, another injustice forgotten by landing. But they had no idea what was about to unfold. What began as bigotry was about to become something unforgettable, something no one on that aircraft would ever erase. Want to see what happens when the person you think is powerless turns out to own the sky you're flying through? Stay right here, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story struck you the deepest? Because this is only the beginning. The terminal pulsed with silent elegance, polished stone floors, walls of crystal-clear glass, and the hush of frequent flyers in designer suits and silk-lined coats. At Gate C-18 in the Northport International Terminal, the velvet rope separating first class from the rest was more than just fabric. It was a line drawn in culture, class, and assumption. Eliot Chambers adjusted his platinum cufflinks, the brushed metal catching the soft gleam from above as he walked through that invisible divide, like he was born for it. He had nothing to prove. His steps were calm, controlled. In the middle of boarding calls, clicking heels, and the echo of rolling suitcases, he moved like someone who made markets rise and fall before breakfast. Clad in a charcoal suit tailored like armor and a pale gray shirt, he looked like a man used to closed-door meetings and global decisions. And no one noticed him, exactly the way he liked it. To Eliot, invisibility wasn't a setback, it was an advantage. There was strength in being overlooked, underestimated. But as he handed over his digital pass and heard the confirming beep, he caught it, the fleeting tension behind the gate agent's smile. A flicker of something, hesitation maybe, just fast enough to miss, if he hadn't spent years learning to notice. Her smile arrived half a second too late. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Chambers," she said with polished courtesy. He nodded once and entered the jet bridge, letting the moment slide off his shoulders. Seat 2F. Window left side. Always his reset point. No matter how brutal the quarterly battles on Wall Street became, that seat was his breath between storms, his line between warfare and restoration. He moved through the first-class aisle with practiced ease. The scent of citrus oil, fine leather, and altitude was as familiar as an old victory. Rows, 1F, 2F, occupied. A man was already stretched out in his seat. Eliot stopped, his brow furrowed ever so slightly as he rechecked the placard. 2F. Correct. The man in the seat, early 50s, white, balding, dressed in a pinstripe navy suit, didn't flinch. He was holding a folded Global Finance Daily like it was a shield. "Excuse me," Eliot said, voice calm, deliberate. "I believe this is my seat." The man barely looked up. "No, I don't think so," he said, lazily flipping his page. His tone was dry, dismissive. Eliot let the silence hang, then turned toward a nearby attendant, young, blonde, eyes glued to her tablet. Her name badge read Tessa. "There seems to be an error," he said, handing her his boarding pass. "Seat 2F. Tessa took it with a polite smile, tapped her screen. Her face shifted. Her smile dimmed. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Chambers. It looks like your seat was reassigned at the last minute." Eliot blinked once. "Reassigned? By whom?" "The system," she said quickly. "It occasionally happens. For high-priority passengers." Her voice turned careful, almost mechanical. "You've been moved to another seat." "Where?" "Economy." Eliot stared at her. "I reserved this seat 5 weeks ago. Paid in full. There's no reason I should be moved. I understand and truly apologize, but you're telling me I was removed from my confirmed first-class seat without any warning?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. But the passenger now in 2F was upgraded at the gate. Last-minute request." "And you granted that? Over a paid reservation?" Tessa hesitated. "It wasn't personal." "It never is," Eliot replied softly. And everything began. Her voice slipped into a tone that felt practiced, almost mechanical. "You've been reassigned to a different seat," Tessa said. "Where?" Eliot asked. "Economy." Eliot stared at her, stunned. "I reserved this seat 5 weeks ago. Paid full fare. There's absolutely no justification for this." "I understand and truly apologize," Tessa replied, her voice wobbling slightly. "It's just that. You're telling me that without any notice or consent, you removed me from first class and put me in economy?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. But—" "And the man in my seat?" Eliot gestured toward 2F. Another pause. "He's the priority accommodation. Does he have a boarding pass for 2F?" "He was upgraded at the gate," she admitted finally. "A last-minute change." "And you honored that over my confirmed booking," Eliot pressed. Tessa blinked. "It wasn't personal." "It never is it?" Eliot's voice was calm, but each word landed like a pin dropping in a silent room. Behind him, a man in seat 1E chuckled, not trying to hide his amusement. "Relax, buddy," the man said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "These upgrades happen all the time. Not the end of the world." Eliot turned slightly, examining the man, a finance guy, no doubt. Mid-40s, smug, pink collar peeking out from beneath a Cambridge and Cross blazer. "I doubt it happens to you," Eliot said evenly. The man grinned. "Don't take it so hard. Could just be a mix-up. Or maybe standards?" That word hung in the air like invisible rot. Tessa cleared her throat again. "Sir, I can offer 25,000 bonus miles and a complimentary beverage if you'll accept the alternate seat." "I'm not interested in consolation," Eliot said. He turned back to the man in 2F. "Are you going to give up the seat?" The man folded his paper, offered a tight, insincere smile. "Sorry, pal. Bumped up last minute. These things happen." Eliot didn't blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulled out a sleek matte black phone, and made a call. His tone was steady, quiet. "Yeah. Activate Protocol 9, Flight 271. Westport to Alta Vista. Threshold's been met." Then he ended the call. Tessa stiffened. "Sir, what was that?" Eliot slipped the phone back into his jacket. "You'll know in about 3 minutes." And just like that, he turned and walked toward the galley. No drama, no fury. Just controlled precision. Passengers stared. Whispers spread. Who was this man? But Eliot Chambers already knew the answer. This wasn't the moment he lost control. This was the moment he took it back. He had just triggered Protocol 9, a clause embedded in every acquisition agreement his firm drafted. It activated instant legal and compliance action if any partner or executive experienced discrimination in public-facing settings. And while the flight crew resumed their routines, still unaware that corporate gears were now grinding into motion, Eliot made his way down the aisle to his reassigned seat in row 27. Posture upright, demeanor unchanged, but with an unmistakable shift in the air around him. Even gravity seemed to tilt in his direction. When he arrived, the seat wasn't empty. A child's juice box lay crushed across the cushion, its sticky red contents bleeding into the fabric. The man in the aisle seat, mid-30s, earbuds in, flip-flops, floral shirt, shrugged lazily. Kid spilled it. They said they'll clean it soon. Eliot didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the nearest attendant, a tall man with slicked back hair and an angular face. His name tag read Grayson. Seat 27A is soaked, Eliot said evenly. It needs to be cleaned or changed. Grayson blinked, struggling to mask his irritation. Let me take a look, he said, flashing a forced smile. He crouched, dabbed at the cushion with a single napkin, then stood. Should be fine now. It's still wet, Eliot replied sharply. Grayson leaned closer, lowered his voice. Listen, sir. You're lucky we found any seat on this full flight. If it's not good enough, you can file a complaint after we land. The message was clear. Sit down and stay quiet. Eliot stared back at him, then slowly, silently sat. Back straight, suit creasing under quiet tension. Minutes passed. The plane climbed. The cabin settled. The murmurs that had followed him from first class faded to silence. Eliot opened his laptop, a custom-build, carbon shell, encrypted drives, loaded with confidential documents for an ongoing merger overseas, and he began to type. Not because it was business as usual, but because calm was part of the strategy. The icy splash hit before Eliot could react, right across his chest, soaking into his shirt and bleeding across the keyboard of his open laptop. He jolted back, sharp breath caught in his throat as the screen flickered once and went black. Standing above him was Grayson, the same smug flight attendant from before, now holding an empty bottle of sparkling water with a perfectly practiced look of horror on his face. "Oh, no," Grayson gasped. "I am so sorry. Must have been the turbulence." My elbow slipped. He reached for a tissue without urgency. But Eliot didn't buy it. The flight had been smooth, not so much as a tremor, and that tiny pause between the spill and the apology was all the proof he needed. Intent had seeped through. Around them, not a single passenger moved. No one asked if he was all right. No one intervened. Some looked away. Others watched blankly, as if a man being disrespected in plain sight was just background noise. Eliot slowly set his soaked laptop aside, eyes narrowing. "You did that on purpose," he said quietly. Grayson's polite expression tightened just slightly. "Why would I do something like that, sir?" "I don't know," Eliot said evenly. "But maybe it has something to do with where I was supposed to be sitting about an hour ago." "Sir," Grayson said, his voice shifting to official tone, "I'd advise you to lower your voice. Otherwise, I'll have to notify the captain." "You can notify whoever you like," Eliot replied, calm and unshaken. "But understand this." He didn't finish. A voice across the aisle cut in. "Excuse me," said a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and a glass of Chardonnay in hand. "Can we keep it down? Some of us are trying to relax." Eliot turned to her slowly, the absurdity of her timing nearly comedic. Next to her, a man in a salmon-colored dress shirt nodded. "Nobody wants drama, man." Grayson gestured vaguely toward the front. "Let me see if we can find another seat." Eliot let out a quiet breath. That would be wise. Moments later, Grayson returned. "There's a seat available near the front. Not quite first class," he said. "Lead the way," Eliot responded. As they moved up the aisle, Eliot noticed something. A white couple, young, smiling, being guided from coach into the premier comfort section just behind first class. Their laughter echoed as they thanked another attendant. Eliot's new seat wasn't there. They placed him in seat 10C, just a few rows shy of economy, tucked beside the lavatory. The screen in front of him was cracked. The window shade wouldn't close fully. He adjusted his blazer, reminding himself who he was. The man who had built Chambers Strategic from a rented co-working space to a multinational empire. The man who had outlasted louder rivals. He was regaining his composure when Grayson returned. this time with a second crew member. A woman with clipped bangs, a plastic smile, and a badge that read, Mara. "Mr. Chambers," she began, voice loud enough to turn heads. "May we speak with you for a moment?" Eliot gave a subtle nod. "Of course." Grayson stepped closer. "We just need to confirm something with you, sir. Standard security procedure." Eliot tilted his head. "Confirm what, exactly?" Mara tapped through a digital tablet. "We need to verify that the name on your reservation matches your ID. Do you have a government-issued ID available?" Eliot didn't move. "You want me to show identification? For a seat that was reassigned to me after I was removed from first class?" "It's a routine check," Mara said quickly. "Just a formality for passenger safety. Is this same check being done for everyone else on board?" She glanced at Grayson, who suddenly found the stitching on his sleeve very interesting. "No one else has been asked, have they?" Eliot continued. Mara hesitated, then gave a stiff smile. "We've had some irregularities on previous flights. It's not about you, sir." "Of course it is," Eliot replied coldly. "You've just been trained to pretend it isn't." All eyes in the section were now on them. Eliot reached slowly into his wallet, pulled out his license and his global entry card, and handed them over without breaking eye contact. Grayson leaned in close, far too close, pretending to inspect the cards as if they were fake currency. "Thank you," he said eventually, stepping back. "Appreciate your cooperation." "It's not cooperation," Eliot said flatly, when I didn't have a choice. The crew turned and walked away. A few passengers resumed their conversations, pretending they hadn't been watching, pretending they hadn't participated in the silence. But not everyone. Across the aisle, a man in a tan vest and worn loafers leaned over, voice low. "They shouldn't have to go through all that just to prove who they are," he said. "Not cruelly, but not kindly either. More observational than empathetic. But you know, with all the fraud these days, you can't be too careful." Eliot turned to him slowly. "Are you suggesting I'm using someone else's ticket?" The man raised his hands quickly. "Hey, just saying. You seemed surprised when they asked. That's all." "Surprised?" Eliot repeated. "No, just tired." Eliot turned his head slowly, expression neutral, but voice edged with quiet steel. "Are you implying I'm using someone else's ticket?" "Hey," the man replied, raising his palms like a shield, "just making an observation. You looked kind of surprised when they asked. That's all." "Surprised?" Eliot repeated. "No, not surprised. Tired." The man nodded like he was offering wisdom. "Well, it's not that unusual. First-class types, they tend to tighten the reins up front. Can't just let anyone through, you know." Eliot leaned slightly forward, his voice like glass just beginning to crack. "And what exactly am I then? Anyone?" "Don't twist my words, friend," the man said, with a tight performative smile. "I'm just saying. You don't look like the usual crowd up there. You don't give off that legacy vibe." "Legacy," Eliot echoed, holding back the bitter laugh threatening to escape. "What you mean is, I don't look like the people you're used to seeing in power." The word echoed in his mind long after the man leaned back, satisfied with himself, clearly convinced he had delivered something insightful. Legacy. That word landed on Eliot like a weight, not because it was new, but because of how quickly it had been sharpened into a weapon. How easily men like that dressed their discomfort in polite vocabulary and expected others to thank them for it. He stared ahead, the seat back in front of him a blank screen. His reflection ghosted in its surface. His body was still, but inside, every thought was a calculated blaze. He had built Chambers Strategic from nothing in an industry guarded by closed doors and glass ceilings, an industry that made people like him earn every square foot twice over. And now, on this flight, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his name, They decided he didn't belong again. The difference this time? They had no idea just how wrong they were. Still, Eliot knew better than to lash out without purpose. Even fury, when channeled, needed form. He sat up straighter and pressed the service call button. It took nearly 5 minutes for anyone to respond. When someone finally did, it wasn't Grayson or Mara. It was someone new. A young woman with dark brown hair pulled neatly back, posture attentive, and caution in her expression. Her name tag read, Jenna. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice tight but courteous. Eliot didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant," he said. Jenna hesitated. "May I ask the nature of your request?" "You may," he replied. "I want a formal explanation for the repeated misconduct I've been subjected to in this cabin, including unlawful ID verification, property damage, and strategically targeted seat reassignment." Jenna's posture faltered. She nodded once and stepped away. 10 minutes passed. Eliot remained still, calm, refusing to glance at his watch or let frustration show. He knew how they expected him to look: angry, agitated, unruly, and he wouldn't give them that. When Jenna returned, she wasn't alone. With her came a woman older than the others, hair swept tightly back, crimson lipstick, and a navy blazer slightly darker than the rest of the crew. Her name tag read Marla. She didn't smile. "Mr. Chambers," she said, standing just beside his seat. "I understand you've expressed some concerns." "I've submitted formal grievances," Eliot corrected, "and I asked to speak with the lead attendant." Marla's jaw twitched. "I'm the cabin supervisor on this flight." "Then let's speak." "I don't believe that's necessary," she said flatly. "Our records show that your seat was reassigned due to a last-minute override. All subsequent actions taken by crew have followed standard safety procedures and policy guidelines." Eliot's voice didn't waver. "Which policy permits identity checks for a confirmed seat holder without cause?" Marla opened her mouth but didn't answer. "Which clause covers deliberate damage to passenger property?" Her tone sharpened. "Sir, we are not required to engage further with travelers who refuse to comply with operational decisions made by the airline." There it was, the legal shield. Empty professionalism polished just enough to deflect accountability. Eliot studied her. "Just so I'm clear," he said, voice precise. "I followed every directive given. I moved seats. I handed over identification. I've remained composed. And now you're telling me that by doing so, I forfeited the right to question why I was singled out?" "That's not what I said," Marla replied quickly, "but it's what you meant." Before she could speak again, a voice from behind them broke the air. "Well, what did you expect?" It was spoken just above a whisper, loud enough for everyone around to hear but soft enough to deny if needed. A woman in her early 40s leaned into the aisle, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, speaking as if she were narrating a truth long held. "People like that," she said, not bothering to hide the implication, "watch a few shows about billionaires and think they can just walk into first class like they belong there." No one corrected her. No one objected. Marla didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. And Eliot? He didn't move. Not yet. But something in the cabin had. And it wouldn't be returning to normal any time soon. Marla merely adjusted the hem of her blazer and crossed her arms, her face unreadable. Eliot turned his head toward the woman who'd made the remark, his voice calm, deliberate. "People like what, exactly?" She blinked, then gave a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, come on, you know what I mean." "Say it out loud," Eliot replied. "If you're going to insult someone in public, at least have the courage to finish a sentence." The smirk faltered, but before she could answer, Marla stepped in. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice." "Why?" Eliot asked, tone unwavering. "Because someone finally said the quiet part out loud." "This isn't a debate," Marla snapped. "No," Eliot said evenly, "it's a pattern. And you're all part of it." A sudden silence rippled through the cabin. Even the ones who had been pretending to sleep were now paying attention. Eliot's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. "You've removed me from my seat. You've damaged my property. You've demanded identification without cause. And now you're defending someone who just publicly degraded me for existing in the wrong row." He paused, letting the words settle. At what point does this stop being protocol and become exactly what it is? Marla's eyes flicked toward Jenna, the younger attendant. "Escort him back to his seat," she ordered. But Jenna didn't move. Eliot rose before she could. "No need," he said coolly. "I'll go myself." He reached for his phone, tapped the screen, and held it to his ear. His voice dropped to a low, measured tone. "Quinn, initiate priority alert. I want full data pulled, seat reassignment logs, updated manifest, crew adjustments. Flag the FAA contact just in case. Something's developing here." There was a pause on the other end, then a calm reply. "Understood. Activating now." Eliot ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and leaned momentarily against the headrest. But peace, as expected, didn't last. Less than a minute later, he heard sharp, precise footsteps returning. Marla was back, her expression hard, her posture stiffer than before. "Sir," she began, tone clipped, "you are not permitted to use unauthorized communication devices once we've reached cruising altitude." Eliot didn't blink. "This device is encrypted. No Wi-Fi, no signal interference. Fully compliant. You can verify that." Marla faltered, caught off guard by the specificity. She shifted tactics. "Regardless, your behavior is becoming disruptive. Several passengers have voiced discomfort. If this continues, we'll be forced to consider you a threat to flight integrity." Eliot stared at her. "Let me make sure I have this straight. I've sat quietly. I've followed every directive. I made one legal call. And that makes me a threat?" "Security protocols are broad for a reason," she snapped. "We can't take risks with non-compliant passengers." Eliot gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "You're not protecting safety," he said. "You're protecting discomfort." "Sir, this is your final warning," she said firmly. "If you continue to escalate—" "Escalate?" Eliot interrupted, his voice still calm, still controlled. "You think this is escalation?" He leaned forward just slightly. "You haven't seen escalation." Marla's jaw clenched. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will involve the captain." "I encourage it," Eliot said. "In fact, I insist." She turned abruptly and strode back up the aisle, her heels clicking like a gavel falling. Before Eliot could exhale, another figure passed by. Young, dressed in pilot blues. His badge shone too brightly, his confidence a bit too fresh. A silver wing pin gleamed over his chest. He didn't stop, didn't make eye contact. But as he passed Eliot's row, he muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Doesn't surprise me. First class is way too easy to fake these days. Flash a name, smile right, and they let anyone in." The words hit like glass shards, not because they were new, but because of how casually they'd been said. As if the insult were a passing observation, as normal as asking for peanuts. Eliot turned his head slowly, watching the pilot disappear behind the cockpit door. And for the first time since takeoff, he didn't feel rage, or even humiliation. What he felt was colder, sharper, resolve. He knew that voice, that tone, that attitude. He'd heard it behind closed doors, in boardrooms, at charity galas, inside Ivy League interviews, the casual contempt of institutions that bent their rules around people like him. And this time, he wasn't just going to outlast it. He was going to unravel it. Some passengers hid behind tablets, pretending to scroll. Others shot brief glances from the corners of their eyes, then quickly looked away. The cabin had shifted, no longer just a vessel in the sky, but something else entirely. It had become a courtroom, a theater, and whether by chance or design, Eliot Chambers now stood in the strange dual role of both defendant and prosecutor. From behind, someone whispered, "Troublemaker." Another added, "Should have known." But Eliot didn't move. He didn't need to, because what none of them realized was that the script they thought they understood had already been rewritten. The story wasn't theirs anymore. It never was. They had made their assumptions, spoken their parts, played their roles. But Eliot Chambers had just flipped the narrative. Deliberately, quietly, he opened a secure app on his encrypted phone, entered the passcode, and activated an internal protocol. Instantly, Chambers' Strategic's internal oversight team received a silent ping. Real-time flight monitoring was now live, satellite-linked, behavior tracking enabled. Audio surveillance flagged and recorded. Data syncing initiated. Evidence was being collected. Logs were compiling. And more importantly, systems were moving. Legal, corporate, reputational. This flight wasn't just cruising anymore. It was heading straight into a reckoning. Eliot exhaled slowly. The pressure on his shoulders didn't vanish, but it shifted. From being pressed down by injustice to standing fully in control its exposure. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Service carts rattled down the aisle, pushed by smiling flight attendants with eyes like polished mirrors, friendly but reflecting nothing. Eliot stared straight ahead as the cart neared his row. It was Grayson again, now with his sleeves rolled just enough to show off a watch that likely cost a semester of tuition. His tan had the unmistakable glow of inherited beach homes and club memberships. "Meal service, sir," Grayson said, not meeting Eliot's gaze. "Chicken, pasta, or vegetarian?" "Pasta," Eliot said calmly. Grayson reached into the cart, paused, then glanced over his shoulder. "Actually, we've run out." "Then the chicken," Eliot replied without missing a beat. "Only one left," Grayson said. "It's reserved for a medical accommodation in row 4. Eliot didn't blink. "Vegetarian." "Apologies," Grayson replied with almost cheery indifference. "That tray was compromised earlier during turbulence. Can't serve it. Safety protocol." Eliot looked at him silently, measured him. "So what you're saying," he said slowly, "is that after serving the entire forward cabin and rows 1 through 9, the only seat on this plane without a meal is mine?" Grayson finally looked him in the eye, smiled faintly. "Seems that way." He rolled the cart onward before Eliot could respond. The clink of cutlery, the smell of warm meals, mockery now plated and steaming. Across the aisle, a man sliced into his chicken with the tidy rhythm of someone used to catered lunches and portfolio reviews. A navy blazer draped across his seat, a small lapel pin gleaming like a badge of belonging. His phone lay face up on the tray, streaming financial headlines. Without turning his head, he spoke. "You know," he said casually, "you could have avoided all this if you just sat where they told you." Eliot said nothing. The man took another bite, swallowed. It's always the same story. Someone wants to make noise, get noticed, and then they're shocked when people push back. Still, Eliot said nothing. "But I get it," the man continued. "You think making noise equals respect. Problem is, respect's earned, not shouted for." Eliot turned toward him, slow and unflinching. "If you've got something to say," he said, voice even, "say it clearly." The man gave a thin smile. "Not kind. I'm just saying, maybe you'd be more comfortable in a cabin that matches your background. Not an insult, just an observation." Eliot leaned in slightly. "No," he said. "What you're doing is packaging your discomfort in polite logic, so you can feel justified in your bias." "It's not bias," the man replied smoothly. "It's structure. Some people try to take what doesn't belong to them and call it progress. And others inherit what they never earned, Eliot countered, and call it merit. So which one are you? The man's jaw stiffened. He picked up his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth, then muttered, "That's the problem with your generation. Everything's about race now." "No," Eliot said quietly. "Everything's always been about race. You're just not used to being called out for it." Before the man could answer, a woman 2 rows ahead turned around. She was dressed in cashmere and contempt, and her voice was sharp. "Can you both keep it down? Some of us paid to enjoy this flight." Eliot tilted his head. "You mean the silence?" he asked. "Or the erasure?" She rolled her eyes. "Whatever drama you brought with you, keep it out of the aisle." And just like that, the illusion snapped back into place. The kind where silence is called civility, where complicity is mistaken for class, where resistance is treated as disturbance. Eliot leaned back in his seat and clasped his hands in front of him. He wasn't angry anymore. He was exact. And precision is what undoes systems. Eliot's hands rested in his lap, every muscle taut like a drawn wire. He didn't feel rage anymore. What he felt was focus. Every insult, every dismissal, every denial had become a line item in an invisible ledger, carefully etched, deliberately numbered, and that ledger had reached capacity. His expression didn't shift, but behind his eyes, war was already being drafted. Not loud, not messy, precise. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the secure matte black phone, executive grade, encrypted, built for one purpose. He unlocked it with a fingerprint. No apps, no distractions, just a single contact, blinking. He tapped. The line connected without a ring. No greeting, no chatter. He spoke just 7 words. "Initiate protocol B13. They've crossed the line." Then he ended the call. No tone, no explanation, no need, because miles below them, in the upper floors of Chambers Strategic's Manhattan HQ, the alert had already hit a private compliance terminal. Instantly, systems ignited. Legal, internal security, media response, corporate governance, all synchronized, all calibrated for this exact scenario. Eliot slipped the phone back into his jacket and leaned into the silence once more. But now, he wasn't enduring. He was commanding. Across the cabin, nothing appeared different. Passengers resumed their browsing, their games, their drinks. But in the cockpit, everything changed. A blinking red notice lit up on the co-pilot screen. Priority escalation, classified alert. The co-pilot leaned toward the captain. "We've got something. Direct from corporate. Level 6 override." The captain, a composed man in his late 50s with steel-gray streaks at his temples, tapped his headset. "Flight 271. Captain Delano speaking." "Go ahead." A brief silence. Then a voice came through. Not FAA, not air traffic, but internal ops, executive channel. "Captain, you are instructed to initiate a compliance audit immediately. This is an order under the new ownership protocol. Open Secure File Tag CSB13. This directive is coming from Chambers Strategic." Captain Delano blinked. "New ownership?" "Confirmed. Please refer to your secure terminal. Opening file now." The co-pilot entered the code. A file opened. "Confidential executive authorization. Ownership transfer verified. Photo, Eliot Chambers. Position, CEO. Chambers strategic majority shareholder, Northwind Air Group, parent company of this flight." Delano's breath slowed. "Get the lead flight attendant," he said quietly. 2 minutes later, Marla was summoned to the cockpit. Her posture was stiff, her mouth pulled tight. "Captain, is there a problem?" Delano turned the screen toward her. "Why don't you tell me?" Her eyes narrowed in confusion. Delano's voice stayed even. "The passenger in seat 10C. Has there been a situation?" Marla hesitated. He's been difficult. Some seating disputes. He refused to comply. Delano raised an eyebrow. Because from where I'm sitting, he owns this aircraft. Marla froze. Sir, that's not possible. It's confirmed, Delano said. As of 3 weeks ago, Mr. Eliot Chambers became the controlling shareholder of Northwind Holdings. He has executive veto rights on all crew operations, including your employment on this flight. The color drained from Marla's face. I didn't know. He never said. He didn't have to, Delano interrupted. And that's exactly the point. Marla opened her mouth but found nothing useful to say. Delano's tone softened, but it didn't carry sympathy. I suggest you return to the cabin. Discreetly inform your team. Begin correcting the narrative now, because I'm almost certain he activated protocol at least 20 minutes ago. And if I know how those systems run, the media division is already tracking this flight. Marla swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Her voice was barely above a whisper. As Marla exited the cockpit, her steps wavered. Her mind raced, rewinding every smirk, every clipped command, every time she'd chosen silence over fairness. The man she had treated like an inconvenience wasn't a problem. He was the future of the company that signed her paycheck. When she reached his row, she paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, she understood who she was speaking to. Eliot looked up, calm, focused, waiting. Mr. Chambers, she said. Her voice no longer carried its usual edge. The captain has asked if you'd be willing to step into the forward cabin. He's arranged a full debrief under executive compliance. Eliot studied her for a moment. Then he stood, adjusting the lapels of his blazer with deliberate care. Thank you, he said. The words were simple, not mocking, but they carried gravity. And the hush that rippled across the cabin as he stepped into the aisle proved it. The woman 2 rows ahead, the one who had told him to stop causing drama, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks suddenly pink. The man across the aisle, who had scolded Eliot between bites of his chicken, lowered his phone and watched him pass, no longer seeing a nuisance, but authority. When Eliot reached the cockpit door, it opened before he could lift a hand. Captain Delano stood inside, tall, composed, the weight of the moment in his eyes. Mr. Chambers, he said with respectful calm, stepping aside. Welcome. Eliot entered the forward cabin. It was usually reserved for flight systems, backup manuals, and closed-off access. But today, it transformed into a boardroom at 35,000 feet. Delano handed him a secured tablet. Eliot unlocked it with a private gesture, a coded motion used only by top executives of Chambers Strategic. A blue sigil pulsed on the screen. Tier 1 override. Active Eliot spoke, his voice formal, controlled. You are instructed to initiate post-landing detainment of the following crew for internal audit. Marla Benton, Grayson Lewis, and Mara Klein. Full transcript of passenger interactions flagged under code CS14. Delano nodded once. Acknowledged. I'll be deplaning via the service hatch, Eliot added. Redirect media feed to internal stream. Statement pending. Understood, Delano replied. Then, with a pause. Sir, I want to apologize for how this was handled. Eliot didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice wasn't cold. It was resolute. It wasn't just poorly handled. It was systemic. And with that, he turned and walked out of the cockpit, the same aisle where he'd been diminished hours ago. But now, every step echoed differently, like quiet thunder. Passengers sat taller as he passed. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered. The tension that had tried to suffocate him earlier now bent in his direction, as if gravity had recalibrated. When Eliot reached his seat again, he didn't sit. He stood calmly beside it and raised his second device, his legal comms channel. His voice was nearly a whisper. Legal. Prepare a release. Statement Package C. Include time-stamped video logs. Begin footage at minute 34 mid-cabin. Use phrasing: ownership present, leadership engaged, policy failure acknowledged. Distribute to Forbes, CNBC, Tech Insider. In that order. He paused. And make sure this isn't a headline. Make it a standard. Behind him, Marla stood in the galley, hands clasped too tightly, breath uneven. Grayson leaned stiffly against the metal cabinet, arms crossed, but his arrogance had evaporated. Mara sat rigid in the jump seat, eyes wide, as if trying to process the shift in atmosphere. The hierarchy had flipped so fast it hadn't yet caught up with her breathing. No one from the crew made eye contact. The aircraft was still in the air, but everything inside it had changed. The man they had mocked now had the power to rewire their careers. And yet Eliot didn't gloat. He didn't punish. He didn't retaliate. He simply recorded, directed, executed. He was exact. He was everything they had never expected a man like him to be. And that was the real reckoning. Because when power doesn't need to shout, it cuts deeper. Minutes later, Captain Delano's voice came over the speakers, more formal than before. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent. Please ensure your seat backs are upright and your belongings secured. We thank you for your cooperation. But this time, the message landed differently. Every passenger heard it not just as an announcement, but as a signal. The world they'd taken off in was not the one they were landing into. The hierarchy had shifted, the unspoken rules rewritten, and the man they thought they could overlook now stood above every one of them. The passengers sat still, unsure whether to look ahead or down, unsure whether they'd be called on to answer for their silence. Up front, Captain Delano's voice returned, calm and corporate. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Alta Vista International Airport. Please remain seated. There will be a brief hold before deplaning. Due to coordination with airport authorities, we thank you for your patience. His tone was measured, diplomatic, almost delicate. Eliot Chambers remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of his seat. His face didn't change. But beneath that stillness, a storm had already erupted behind the scenes. Even before the wheels had touched the ground, Chambers Strategic's Executive Ethics Division had received and circulated his compliance report. By the time the plane rolled to a stop, a convoy of black SUVs lined the edge of the tarmac, each bearing the discreet insignia of Chambers' internal affairs. 4 senior officers waited at the base of the descending jet bridge, dressed in dark suits, tablets in hand, their expressions sharp beneath the glare of the California sun. Inside the aircraft, the energy shifted like a vacuum. Marla was pale, her hands trembling as she stared blankly at the metal panel across from her. Grayson stood behind her, jaw locked so tightly it looked sculpted from stone. Mara hadn't spoken in over an hour. Her fingers clutched the hem of her blazer as her eyes blinked again and again, as though replaying every moment of the last 6 hours in slow motion. Then came the call over the speaker. Cabin doors to arrival and cross-check. The door hissed open. Only this time, no welcome crew. The first figure to enter was the lead compliance officer, tall, exact, his badge clipped to a lanyard bearing a single symbol, Sea-Level Oversight. His voice was as sharp as his stance. Marla Benton, Grayson Lewis, Mara Klein. By order of the Executive Board, you are hereby relieved of duty pending immediate administrative review. You will accompany us to the corporate field office. Refusal will result in immediate termination under Clause 7A. A gasp passed through a row of nearby passengers. Marla stood slowly. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. She knew the code. Clause 7A didn't mean suspension. It meant escalation. To public ethics boards, external oversight, and if needed, the media. This is a mistake, Grayson muttered. He never even said who he was. The officer didn't flinch. He didn't have to. Your job was to follow policy, not guess pedigree. I didn't mean, Mara began, her voice cracking. The officer raised a hand. Everything from this point forward is being recorded. Your statements will be entered into your review transcripts. I suggest you speak only with your counsel. And just like that, the crew was escorted off the plane, not in shame, but in silence, a silence louder than any siren. The passengers instinctively parted as the attendants walked down the aisle, some turning away, others watching with stunned fascination. Retribution had stopped being theoretical. It had become tangible, measured, unfolding right before them. Eliot hadn't moved once since touchdown. He hadn't spoken a single word. He didn't need to, because real power rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives in silence. Sometimes it arrives in structure. A few minutes later, another officer stepped aboard, this one holding a data pad with Eliot's name already displayed at the top. "Mr. Chambers," he said, "the board has issued full clearance. Crew logs, passenger statements, and compliance records have all been secured. Internal audit protocols now in effect." Eliot nodded once. "Public timeline? Press embargo until morning," the officer replied, "though we expect some leaks. Official language has been seeded with key outlets. You'll lead the statement remotely from HQ. There's a press team in the terminal if you'd like to appear." Eliot looked past him toward the cabin. "Not yet," he said. "Let them sit with the silence first." The officer gave a respectful nod and stepped away. Eliot turned slowly and looked down the aisle. The same faces that had dismissed him, sneered, whispered, or watched him with indifference. Now they watched with silence, with uncertainty, with the sinking realization that they hadn't just misjudged him. They had underestimated a man who had built the ground beneath their feet and could pull it away at will. Some gave him a cautious nod. Others looked away, unsure how to reconcile the man they'd reduced to a disruption with the man who now stood above every protocol they thought protected them. And outside, on the tarmac, beneath a sky as sharp as his focus, power was waiting. Outside, the terminal buzzed with its usual noise, arrivals, announcements, wheels clacking against polished floors. But within the executive wing of Alta Vista International, a different kind of quiet had settled. Calm, composed, intentional. Eliot Chambers stood by a wide pane of glass overlooking the tarmac. His reflection hovered over the image of the plane he had just stepped off. Two versions of himself, finally aligned. Behind him, the soft murmur of his legal team filled the space. Compliance updates, scheduling briefings, early headlines flickering across sleek digital screens. A dozen things moving at once. But Eliot stayed still. This moment wasn't about cleanup. It wasn't about retaliation. It was about redirection, about taking the weight of what had happened and anchoring it in something deeper than headlines or policy memos. It needed roots. It needed reform. He turned toward the private corridor that would lead him to the lower levels, to his car, to everything waiting next. But then, "Mr. Chambers?" The voice came from behind. Quiet. Hesitant. He turned and saw a young woman, early 20s. Light brown curls pulled into a bun, her uniform wrinkled from a long shift. Her eyes full of something too complex to be called fear or guilt. Her name tag read, Sophie. He remembered her. She had stood silently near the galley during the meal service, eyes downcast while Grayson lied, while Marla smirked. Her body language had betrayed her discomfort, even though her mouth had stayed shut. Now she stood straighter, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she said quickly, "but I couldn't leave without saying something." Eliot gave her a small nod. His expression was open, but guarded. "I saw everything," Sophie continued. "I didn't speak up. And I've been thinking about that since we landed. I was afraid of losing my job, of being pulled into it. But that's not an excuse. It was cowardice. He said nothing. Let the silence do its work. Sophie took a breath. I saw an article about your equity initiative. Flight Forward, right? Training programs, community mentorships, an accountability board. I want to help. I don't want to just regret this. I want to do something. Eliot studied her for a long moment. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She wasn't asking for absolution. She was asking for a starting line. You'll receive a message from my team, he said finally. There's a pilot program launching next quarter. If you're serious, you'll be on it. Her eyes widened. Thank you. Truly. He offered the faintest smile. We don't need perfect allies, he said. Just brave ones. She nodded, then stepped back, her spine straighter than before, as she disappeared into the terminal's crowd. Eliot turned again toward the private elevator. But as he passed one of the large displays, news updates rolling across the bottom ticker, a headline caught his eye. Former Northwind crew manager releases public statement after dismissal. Curious, Eliot slowed, tapped the audio stream into his earpiece, and listened. The voice was familiar. Marla, stripped of command, but clearer than he had ever heard it before. My name is Marla Benton. I was the cabin supervisor on Flight 271. I was terminated yesterday following a review of my conduct. And I want to say something, not because I was told to, but because it's overdue. Her voice cracked, but carried forward. I was wrong. I acted from assumption, from habit, from inherited bias I never questioned. And in doing so, I failed someone who deserved my service, not my suspicion. I watched the footage. I saw myself. I wasn't who I thought I was. And that truth has changed me. The screen cut to a modest community center. A banner flapped softly in the wind above its door. Community Flight Initiative, sponsored by Chambers Strategic. Marla sat on the front steps, now in civilian clothes. Her posture different, her tone humble. I asked to volunteer here. I want to help kids who dream of flying, but don't see people who look like them in the cockpit. I don't know if it's enough, but it's a beginning. Eliot stood for a long moment, then reached up and tapped the earpiece off. He didn't need to hear more, because that, not suspension, not termination, not press coverage, was the ripple effect he had aimed for. Not compliance, not appeasement, but transformation. Back at the elevator, his assistant approached, tablet in hand. Sir, she said softly, press is on standby. Boardroom's prepped. Do you want to review your talking points? Eliot shook his head. No, we don't control this moment with words. Let the actions speak. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, and just before they closed, he caught one last glimpse through the glass wall. A father holding his young son by the terminal window, pointing out toward the tarmac. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder. His finger traced the silhouette of the jet Eliot had just stepped off. That was the future. That was who this had all been for. And the man they had once tried to erase was now the reason change had landed. Permanent, deliberate, just beginning.